I'm Coach Tarek.
And I'm Vanessa.
We are your movement experts, and we are here to educate health and fitness professionals with the tools to create real change for and within the industry.
Hello and welcome to Purpose-Driven Movement. My name is Vanessa. I'm excited today to bring you our guest, Paul Taylor. I have had the pleasure of knowing Paul for many years. When I was a baby personal trainer, I got exposed to all of these incredible presenters and educators in the industry through PTA Global. And Paul Taylor was one of their presenters and educators. And if you've ever seen him speak at a conference or anywhere, to be fair, he is one of the most captivating presenters you will ever encounter. He makes complicated science sound like it's for toddlers. He just creates such beautiful simplicity around it. So passionate about it. His own personal story, how he's come through the military and all of the stress that he's gone through to then create and dive deeper into the science of health and longevity is incredible. I highly recommend for you to go check out his podcast and to look at his book. We talk a little bit about it today in the podcast as well. Today's podcast is all about muscle, and it's all about training for health and longevity. This is such a buzz area. I'm so excited to dive into this with Paul. So stay tuned, take notes, come back to it. This is definitely an episode you want to listen to a couple of times.
Check out FTI's latest offer, which is 15% off of any of our online courses. Simply go to www.functionaltraininginstitute.com and input PDM 15 at cart checkout.
I'm so excited to bring you our guest today, Paul Taylor, the notorious PT. You'll understand why. He's notorious for going down rabbit holes, tangents, or your favorite analogy, Matrix, blue pill, red pill. We will see which one we want to take today. I was just telling you how challenging it was for me today to try to figure out what on earth to ask you. So for our listeners, PT has just written a book. It's called Death by Comfort, and I'm about halfway through. It's excellent. It's narrated by yourself, so great listening. And you know what really got me is your whole skeletal muscle section. Like, science nerds all around will be just losing their shit over this. So you know what? I thought, let's talk about muscle, because for PTs, for fitness enthusiasts, it's the most basic, hyphenated. It's the most basic thing that we learn. And from the sounds of what you researched and what you've gone through, I would love to know why you think that skeletal muscle is not a dumb part of the body.
Yes, so we used to think that it was pretty dumb, really, that all it did was sort of move bones and that was it. But we now know that it is a really, really critical part of our metabolism. So something called myokines, which a lot of people have not heard of. I've been geeking out on myokines for quite a while. And so these are molecules that are present in contracting muscle. And we've known for many, many years, the first myokine, I think, was identified about 60 years ago. And we've known for many years that what myokines do inside the muscle is they help with fat oxidation. They help with glucose disposal to create energy for the muscle. And then we knew that they were then responsible for the plastic changes that we get in the muscle to help the muscle become bigger, faster, stronger. But what we discovered probably in the last 5 to 10 years is that these myokines are actually messenger molecules that don't just stay in the muscle. They actually spill out of the muscle and they get into our circulation and they have a positive impact. They're signaling molecules. So let me take a step back. A myokine is a type of cytokine. So cytokines are signaling molecules in the body, and they're broadly split up as inflammatory and anti-inflammatory cytokines. And not many people had heard of cytokines until COVID, in the COVID shitstorm, right? And then everybody heard about cytokines because it was that whole cytokine-driven inflammation that was causing a lot of the issues and a lot of deaths, right? So we can have inflammatory and anti-inflammatory cytokines. And then there's all sorts of different types of cytokines. So myokines are a signaling molecule that is produced inside the muscle, and we now know get out into our circulation and have a positive effect on every organ and every organ system in the body. So they improve the health of your entire immune system. They also improve the health of your gut, your whole digestive system. We now know myokines can influence the gut bacteria, which is another rabbit hole that we could go down later. We know that myokines help your pancreas to secrete insulin. They help your liver to dispose of glucose, helping prevent type 2 diabetes and neurodegenerative disorders. They help to remodel your bone and muscle throughout your life. And they also get into the brain. So one myokine in the brain is called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And that actually helps you to grow new brain cells, even in your 90s, which we didn't think was possible until 1997 when the first research paper came out. And they have just a positive impact all the way throughout your brain. Not only does BDNF help you to create new brain cells, but it protects the brain cells that you have against damage. So if me and you were to be in a car right now and have a car crash and sustain an identical brain injury, if you'd been exercising earlier, you would suffer less brain damage than me, who wasn't exercising, because of the protective effects of BDNF. And we know that one of the ways that BDNF is triggered in the brain is that lactate, which a lot of people call lactic acid, but geeky physiologists like me call it lactate. We used to think that lactate was just a waste fuel from anaerobic metabolism. We now know lactate is actually a fuel for cells, and it crosses the blood-brain barrier and triggers the release of BDNF, which is pretty cool stuff. So we now have identified, this is the really cool shit about myokines. We have now identified more than 600 myokines, and we only know what about 60 of them do.
It's incredible to think that we sat there in my physiology lecture back in the day at uni, and you thought you knew how muscles worked. And you're basically telling us that muscles are in itself an organ that signals and it secretes. And that's why, we know these substances, if we've done a little bit more study, anaerobic or aerobic function gives you like all of these waste products, lactic acid or lactate, as you like to call it. I love that influences the brain. And this is where you're talking about the importance of interval training or high intensity interval training, because that's what's going to bring that lactate to the forefront, really, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I often say to people, I do a lot of corporate work these days. I talk to a lot of people about exercise. And a lot of people say, I like exercise. And a lot of people go, I don't like it because it makes me uncomfortable. And my first response is, it's supposed to be bloody uncomfortable. That is why it is good for you, because it's a stressor. And it activates stress response proteins, which is another rabbit hole that we can go down, the stress response proteins, which then switch on hundreds of protective genes. But also, we now know that particularly vigorous exercise releases a bucket load of myokines. So anytime your muscles are contracting, whether you are walking, running, lifting weights, dancing, whatever it may be, they are producing myokines. And we know that some, maybe not all, but are produced in relation to exercise intensity. So intensity can be a really important thing, and particularly around lactate. Like, there's such an interest now in lactate and just how it is not the molecule that we used to think that it was. We just thought it was a waste product. We now know that cells can recycle it and use it for energy. But for me, the fact that it crosses the blood-brain barrier and then triggers the release of BDNF in the brain is pretty cool shit. And I think it has evolutionary mechanisms, right? Because if you think back in the caveman days, like, when would you be running fast in caveman days? So something's about to eat you, or you're trying to kill something, right, for prey. So it made perfect sense to me that when you're going at that exercise intensity, that the brain would release more BDNF, because BDNF encodes for learning and memory. So it's basically, if you've just been chased by a lion, it's saying to you, Vanessa, remember where this is, because this is a friggin' dangerous place. Or likewise, if you find some prey, remember where this is. Now, clues to this come from research on animal models. So particularly rats and mice, which are very, very easy to study. So you put them in a water maze. They hate water, right? So they try to get out of that water. And we see that lots of studies showing that young mice do much better at remembering once they know how to get out. they do much better at remembering than old mice do. And then they sampled their brains. The young mice had got more BDNF in it. But then they did a pretty cool study where they took old mice and put them on a running wheel, so the mice equivalent of a treadmill, and then threw them in the water. And the old mice did better, as well as the young mice, in that spatial memory. Now, spatial memory is really, really important for animals and us humans as well, right? Remembering where you are in space, so that you need to remember where's your tribe and where's the prey, where's the watering, all of those things. And what they found is that when they sampled the brains of the old mice, they had BDNF levels the same as the young mice after they'd gone on the treadmill. So for me, that was the smoking gun. And then when you see that lactate then triggering the release of BDNF, for me, it just makes perfect sense that when you're exercising hard is generally because you are fighting or flighting or trying to kill some prey. And so it made perfect sense to me as a neuroscientist that the evolution would be designed so that you remembered things in times of stress.
It's awesome. And I suppose that's where you're getting that protective element from BDNF is you're looking at longevity. A lot of people are looking at longevity and health and how to be healthier longer, not even just live longer. And I'm assuming that's part of that benefit is because it's protecting your brain from degeneration and other adverse risks.
That's the key thing, is that I certainly want to not just live long, but I want to have a good health span. And in order to have a good health span, then you need your cognitive capacities, you need your physical capacities as well. So, I mean, I was just in a workshop yesterday and I was saying to people, you know, there's lots of older people in the room, and I said, anybody over the age of 40 needs to lift heavy shit. It's as simple as that, right? Cardiovascular training, hugely important, and we can jump into that rabbit hole if you want, but also next to your VO2 max, that is the single biggest predictor of how long that you're going to live. And also it's predictive of quality of life. But what is also predictive of how long you're going to live, and probably even more predictive of quality of life, is your muscle strength. And normally they're used interchangeably, muscle mass, muscle strength. And we think that just muscle mass is a proxy for muscle strength. And we see in heaps of studies that older adults who have more grip strength live longer, right? But grip strength is just a proxy for overall muscle strength and functional capacity.
Yeah, so we've got two sides of the coin that we're looking at for longevity. Essentially, we've got that kind of aerobic function, VO2 max, which I'd like to talk about, and also that strength, which is super important. Let's maybe start with VO2 max. So our fitness enthusiasts, or the people who are unsure, what is VO2 max and why do we need it?
Yeah. So your VO2 max is your maximum oxygen capacity. So it is the maximum amount of oxygen that you can extract from your lungs and use functionally. And it's measured in milliliters per kilograms per minute. So everybody gets a standard number. So anybody who's ever done a VO2 max test knows it's pretty horrible for the last couple of minutes. Or a very good field proxy actually is a beep test. And so anybody who's ever done that knows the last couple of minutes is just horrible. And that's where you're breathing out your arsehole. But that is when we get your maximum oxygen capacity, and they use a little mask and they're measuring the oxygen that's going in and the oxygen that's going out, and then they can tell how much you're using, and then they tend to normalize it per body weight, and then you get a number. So the highest VO2 maxes in the world are in the 90s, and they tend to be cross-country skiers, tend to be, as a group, the fittest cardiorespiratory athletes in the world, reasonably closely followed by elite cyclists, Tour de France guys and stuff like that. And then you have like triathletes and marathon runners and stuff like that are dropping into the 80s and some in the high 70s, right? So obviously a lot of those sports, it's a mixture of your VO2 max and then your lactate threshold as well, which is pretty important. But what we know, there was a great study done in the Journal of the American Medical Association, JAMA. I think it was 2018. And I'm going from memory here, so the details will be a little bit scratchy, but they had 122,000 people that had actually done VO2 max testing. So they were older people, a bit like me, old blokes and women who had basically gone for a heart check, a stress test, and had their VO2 max measured. And then they followed them for 15 years. And so quite a few people died and quite a few obviously didn't die. But then they looked back and ran the statistics to see, was fitness levels 15 years ago predictive of how long you're going to live? And it was absolutely predictive. So, and again, I'm going from memory here, but they put people in low levels of VO2 max. So that's the lowest 20%, lowest 25 high. Then they had low normal, and then above normal, and then high, and then elite. Elite was the top 2.5 or 3%. And what they found is a dose response in terms of survival. So for every level of extra fitness, that was protective. Now, this is stuff that you do not see in medicine. So if I'm on blood pressure medication, I take 1 tablet, it's good for my blood pressure. That doesn't mean 2 tablets is better, and 3 is better, and 4 is better, and 5, right? So that just doesn't happen. But we saw a very clear dose response. And then they did hazard ratios for risk of death. And so typically what they're doing when they're doing a hazard ratio is they'll compare the worst group and they'll say they had a hazard ratio of 1, and they use that as a comparator. So basically what they found is that those who were of low normal had a risk reduction of about 95% compared to the lowest 20%. So flip it on its head. If you were in the lowest 20-25%, you were 95% more likely to die in the next 15 years than somebody who was low normal. And then those who were above average were protective. Those who were high, even more protective. And those who were elite were even more protective. And here was the data. Those who were low fitness had a 404% increased risk of death in the next 15 years compared to those who were elite.
There's no drug in the world that has that kind of positive effect on longevity or health.
I would say to people, there are people all around the world spending a shitload of money, unproven longevity molecules in inverted commas like NMN and NR, the likes of which are touted by influencers like that wanker Professor David Sinclair, who's a Harvard professor and he's on friggin' every podcast talking about NMN and these longevity molecules. And he has been outed by his Harvard colleagues as being a charlatan. But he's talking about resveratrol being a longevity molecule years ago, and everybody's buying resveratrol, and it's being proven to have no impact on your longevity whatsoever. And now he's doing the same playbook with NMN. Now, NMN may end up being beneficial, but it is not proven, nowhere near it. And then you have these people who are not doing anything around their fitness. And their fitness, like your cardiorespiratory fitness, is by far and away the biggest predictor of how long you're going to live. And the second one, as I said earlier, is your muscle strength / muscle mass. And that's really important for a number of different reasons. So, as you know, I used to certify personal trainers when I had PT Academy. When I was teaching around older adults, I said, the most important thing that you need to train in older adults is muscular power. And firstly, people couldn't understand what the hell I said because I can't pronounce that word. Muscular power. That's the one. It sounds like you're playing golf. I say muscular power. And people go, isn't that just for athletes? But if we think about it, the equation for power is, I won't put you on the spot here. Let's see how your physics is. It's work done divided by time. So it's force times distance divided by time. So power can be moving a heavy weight, but not very quickly, or moving a moderate weight a bit quicker, or moving a light weight very, very quickly. So when an older adult is walking down the street and trips, that ability to recover their feet or to stick their hand out and stop themselves from falling is muscular power. And we know that you lose fast twitch fibers first. We know that the average adult loses muscle mass at the rate of 3 to 8% per decade, and it tends to accelerate. And it is not unusual for somebody who's 75 years old to have lost up to half of their muscle mass, and most of it fast twitch fibers. So this means, number one, that their capacity for producing myokines is massively reduced. So the world's best drug, they can't produce anywhere near as much of it. And because they're functionally inhibited, they're not using those muscles as much. So when we preserve our muscle, particularly our fast twitch muscles, which give us muscular power, we're able to prevent ourselves from falling. And if you're 65 and you fall and you break a hip or a pelvis, you got a 50% chance of being dead within 5 years. So the sixth biggest killer, falls are the sixth biggest killer of people of the age of 65. And they're the fifth biggest killer of people the age of 75 and over. So there's the falls is one thing, but then it's about functional capacity. So when you lose muscle, you're less able to do activities of daily living. And then if people trip and fall, then they become scared and they tend to withdraw socially. And then when you withdraw socially, you start to lose massive amounts of brain function because the brain is essentially a social organ. So there are a number of direct mechanisms, and then there's indirect mechanisms why preserving muscle is hugely, hugely important.
And you can see a lot of parallels. I mean, you talk about that reduction of muscle as you age, and there's a lot of studies now to suggest or that prove that if you continue training, that effect is pretty negligible, if at all. But you're just using that example of a fall. If you're physically active, if you're training power, so the ability to move fast, the ability to pick up your feet and avoid obstacles on the footpath or step properly down, becomes much less of a risk, because you don't need to catch yourself if you can already avoid those things in your path. And I think that that's almost a bigger factor, is that not only would you be better at recovering from a fall if you have that muscle mass, it's very likely that you probably wouldn't fall anyway, because you're actually much more functional.
That's right. And this is where stability comes into it as well. And so for people training older adults, stability training and one-legged training becomes really, really important. And encouraging older adults to wear minimalist shoes and spend a bit of time in bare feet, because of those proprioception from your feet up to your brain. Like when you start to lose that proprioception, then you become screwed. And you see old people walking down the street that are looking at their feet and being really, really unsteady. And so then they're more likely to fall. But then their confidence goes. So they, as I said earlier, they go out less and then their brain deteriorates. But the other thing is really important for muscle mass is also around metabolism. So you'll have heard, every PT in this will have heard, every fitness professional will have heard clients, particularly older clients, blaming their metabolism for putting on weight. And the studies show that people do their metabolic rate drops from their 20s into their 30s, into their 40s, into their 50s, into their 60s and beyond. And the studies show that 100% of the loss of metabolic rate until people hit their 60s is explained by losing muscle. 100% of that loss of metabolic rate. And when they lose the metabolic rate, they eat the same amount of calories, then they put on fat, and then they diet. And as you well know, when they diet, they'll lose water first, then muscle, then fat. And then when they realize this diet is unsustainable, they'll put the water back on, they'll put fat back on, and they won't put the muscle back on. So they come back to their original weight, but they're proportionally more fat and less muscle. So they've actually changed their body composition in a negative way. And then their metabolism slows even further because they've lost that. And then it's Groundhog Day.
It just brings everything back in a really nice circle, because you're talking about myokines and how they boost pretty much every function in your body, upkeeping your muscle mass, upkeeping your aerobic capacity, your anaerobic capacity. That's metabolism. Your skeletal muscle mass is your metabolism. You lose that, your body will start to decline just rapidly, is from what we're understanding, really.
Yeah, and as well as muscle, you start to lose mitochondrial function. And our mitochondria are hugely important in our physical and mental health. And what we now know is that the vast majority of both physical and mental health issues are mitochondrial functions. And we know that exercise preserves mitochondrial function. And particularly high intensity interval training drives mitochondrial biogenesis. Now, I don't want people to think that they should only do high intensity interval training, because we know that zone 2 training is actually good for your mitochondria as well, and really helps with mitochondrial function. And actually the studies show that if you take a bunch of people who've never done weight training before, particularly if they're 40s or 50s or beyond, and if you have two groups and some of them just start doing resistance training straight away, and the other guys do 6 or 8 weeks of aerobic training, particularly around zone 2, and then do resistance training, the second group actually puts on muscle quicker. So it appears that the aerobic training primes the body for putting on muscle, and we think it's to do with the mitochondria.
That's incredible. I hadn't heard that one before. That's really, really interesting, because we've heard every other bro in the industry say cardio will strip you of your gains.
Here's the thing. And look, for the bros in the industry who are into their bodybuilding, if your major goal is maximizing the amount of muscle, then do less cardio, lift lots of weights, and take all sorts of supplements and other shit that people take to optimize it. But if your goal is health and longevity, then there needs to be a balance. And we know that cardiovascular fitness is more predictive than muscle of how long you're going to live. But we do need a balance. And this is the thing. People who are training 50-year-old Mr. and Mrs. Nurkenfurken have got to not impose their belief systems on them. They've got to be saying, what are your major goals here around health, longevity, health span? And then they need to help them train accordingly, and probably explain to them that in order to be as healthy for as long as you possibly can, you need a really good base of cardiovascular fitness. And then we need to work on a bit of anaerobic metabolism and optimize your VO2 max. And we need to also do some muscle mass. And yes, there are trade-off effects in the training of those things, right? There's a trade-off between your aerobic capacity and your anaerobic capacity. And then there's a trade-off between your muscle size and the amount of cardio that you're doing, particularly the aerobic stuff. But it all goes into the mix around a healthy lifestyle and a healthy body and a healthy mind, because it is very, very complicated when you get into muscle metabolism and all of the other metabolic health parameters that need all of those things.
So what I hear from that, for people who might be maybe a little bit confused as to what would be the best way for them to start, is start with what you like. Because if you enjoy something, that is going to keep you doing it, number one. And that's the most important thing, is you need to do something that's sustainable, but something that you actually enjoy doing for the most part, so that it doesn't feel like a chore. And then once you kind of have that in rhythm, then you can just kind of factor in some of those other parts that you need to add in to get that nice balance. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And, you know, when I used to train people, I remember having clients that didn't really want to train at a high intensity when we were doing cardio. You know, I was wanting them to do high intensity interval training and stuff like that. The wiser me now would be going, you know what, that's cool. Just give them a base of 8 weeks where we're doing a bit of zone 2 training, and we're then maybe doing a bit of basic resistance training if they're into that as well, because that's going to give them a really, really good platform. And also the research shows is that when you just encourage people but let them set their own intensity, they will eventually get to the intensity that you want them to do, but they're more likely to persevere as a client. If we push people too hard initially, a lot of them will leave. So I think that's one of the things as a trainer. Find out what they like, and, you know, find out if they like to be pushed or don't like to be pushed, but don't get into the trap of pushing them too hard, of doing what you probably know is best for them right now, because a lot of people, particularly if they haven't had a training history, they need time for their body to adapt.
I really like that. I was definitely a little bit like yourself. I loved being pushed in my 20s. In my 30s, it's definitely now the approach of like, okay, what does my body need? What am I looking for more of? And to get adherence to exercise for most of the people who I deal with now is find what you like, do it more often so that you can enjoy exercise. And, you know, exercise is meant to be empowering. If you have to rely on someone to self-select every single time, you have to rely on someone else to select intensity or absolutely everything. Every single time you train, you're not listening to your body. You're not noticing the signals that it's giving you. So it is really important to be able to say, yeah, okay, I can manage this intensity. I can go from there. When we're looking at intensity, you're mentioning zone 2. Now, I think that this is where some people might get a little bit confused. If we're looking at a longevity model, we're talking about heart rate intensity, right? They use a 3-zone model, whereas a lot of fitness apps, a lot of training platforms will probably use a 5-zone model. Could you help us decipher what's happening here?
Yeah, look, what I would say about heart rate training, the most important thing to understand about heart rate training is the limitations around it. Because I used to be very geeky, exercise physiology, talking about percentages of heart rate max, and then talking about percentages of heart rate reserve, which we could get into all of that stuff. But the most important thing to understand is how they work those things out. Like, heart rate training is really good if and only if you know your maximum heart rate. If you don't know your maximum heart rate, it is a lottery. Now, for a lot of people, that lottery will be reasonable, because how they actually do it, just imagine a line. They test thousands of people. Just imagine we're testing, even let's just pick 100 people, and we test their maximum heart rate, and we have a graph that on one axis is their age and the other one is their max heart rate. They will be a scatter graph around that, but they will be clustered reasonably tightly. And then what they do is they draw a line of best fit. That line of best fit then gives you equations that we use, like 220 minus your age. And then there's lots of other different equations. Now, if you're one of the people that is very close to that line, then that's an awesome equation for you. But you can be a complete outlier. So I'll give you a great example of this. I had a mate when I was back in the armed forces. I was a Navy officer, used to fly in helicopters, and I had a mate who's a Royal Marines officer. And he let himself go a little bit. He had a desk job and got a bit fat and unfit. And then his next job was going to be a much more active job. And he came to me because he knew I was an exercise physiologist. And he said, mate, I'm trying to get fit and I'm trying to lose weight and I'm working in my fat burning zone. You remember those fat burning zones, right? Which we can get into the limitations of those. But anyway, he was working at a particular heart rate that he'd been on this app, and that was saying that was your fat burning zone. And he was saying it's so slow, I have to keep slowing down. And I explained to them how they do this max heart rate. So we actually tested his max heart rate. And so I think he was about 40 at the time, 38 or 40. So let's just say it was 40. So his age predicted using that 220 miniature age would be 180, his max heart rate. His actual max heart rate was 212. So he's 32 beats out. So it kept telling him that he had to slow down and slow down. He was working nowhere near the intensity that he should have been at. And he was probably a pretty severe outlier, but there's lots of outliers, and there's people who, that's 10, 15 beats out. And for those guys, when they're looking at zone 2 and zone 3, they can be in completely the wrong zone. So the way that I explain it to people is zone 2 is you can talk, but you cannot sing. And I actually think that is a better predictor than looking at a number, because particularly if people are wearing watches, I don't know if you've noticed that my Apple Watch, pretty good at low heart rates. When I get to high heart rates, it's shit house. So people who are doing zone training and looking at a watch to try and get it, there's just so much error in there. They could just make shit up and they'd probably be okay.
Well, you're right. And I think it goes back to that, learning to listen to your body, listening to the signals that it's there. There's a reason why you're short of breath. And, when you're talking to someone, you might be able to have a conversation, but it sounds a little bit like that because you need to take a breath in between. That's zone 2.
That's right. There you're at the upper end of zone 2. We can have a conversation, but I know you're exercising. And if you can have if you're like, Jesus, shut up, and you certainly can't sing, you're in zone 3 or maybe even above, right? So this is why I'm not the biggest fan of using heart rate training unless you actually know somebody's maximum heart rate. And then heart rate training can be very good.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I love the zone model or the RPE model where you're just monitoring your own breath. I've actually recently taken all of my cardio class coaching to monitoring your breath model, which is just so much easier to coach as well as a coach if you are doing it like that.
And perceived exertion, that's another great one. And, there's 2 perceived exertion charts. There's the old one, the 6 to 20, which us physiologists would use, and that kind of approximates to multiply by 10, and that's heart rate. Or there's the 1 to 10, where 10 is, oh my fucking God, I'm going to die. That's my interpretation of the RPE. I think I have that in my book, actually.
Yeah, I like that one. So speaking of the, oh my God, I'm going to fucking die, that intensity, let's talk about that intensity, because I talk about this in my class. I don't think that a lot of people would ever get into that intensity. Maybe they don't need to. But what you're saying in terms of high intensity interval training, we need to get a little bit past that zone 2 to feel some benefit of lactate. And, once you get to that top end, you're at 10, where are we looking at? Do we want to get to 10 once a week? Do we want to get to 10 once a month? What are some benefits of working there?
Yeah, look, I encourage people, if their goal is to optimize their VO2 max and particularly their anaerobic performance, that you want to try and get there once a week. But it's freaking uncomfortable. And the whole high intensity interval training, and people talk about max efforts. Like, let's be very clear on this. You cannot do max effort for any more than about 10 seconds. So when people are talking about 30 seconds max effort, that is not 30 seconds max effort. You will run out of most of your ATP PC after about 10 seconds. So just try it, whether it's on a treadmill or the VersaClimber is one that I use, and it's an evil piece of equipment. Like, if you go hell for leather, after about 10 seconds, you're going to drop off. So max efforts, that's really interesting. That is 10 to 15 maybe seconds. And then very high efforts, that's the sort of stuff that you can do for 30 seconds and up to a minute. And if anybody's ever tried to do a minute sprint on a VersaClimber, like, that is evil, 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 evil. A lot of when you're training for VO2 max, typically 3 to 5 minute intervals will be really, really good. And it's basically at the end of those 3, 4 minute, 5 minute intervals, you are toast, right? It's like you've just run a beep test, and then you recover for about the same amount of time and then repeat those intervals. So doing 3 or 4 of those intervals, that's a really good way to improve your VO2 max. Or doing something like 30-second intervals with a 1-to-1 rest recovery ratio and do maybe 10 of those. those, because after 10 of those, you're pretty toast, right? And they are pretty hard. There are definitely benefits of operating at that top end, but you need to make sure if your clients are at that top end, number one, they need to be pretty psychologically robust because it's friggin' hard. And number two, they need to be physiologically robust because they got any sort of heart issue, you do not want to be taking them there.
Or any kind of musculoskeletal issue, right? You're pushing your body to its limits when you're at a 10, and that's really hard and it's a little bit risky.
It's the equivalent in resistance training of doing 1RM stuff. And there's very few people who should be doing, maybe it's a 2RM, right? But for me, the only people who should be doing 1RM are elite athletes because the risk reward ratio is pretty low. And I think that's where you get into those absolute all out efforts, the risk reward ratio starts to get pretty low, right? When you're 10 seconds of pure 100%, the risk of injury is significantly bigger. And that's why for a lot of people, that 30 seconds is a lot more doable, but you got to say you got to pace yourself for 30 seconds or a minute, or certainly the 3 to 5. There's a lot less chance of injuring people and you'll get the vast majority of the benefits anyway.
So I just want to summarize real quick. If we prime our system zone 2 for 6 to 8 weeks before we start resistance training, that seems to have a positive effect on our strength, on our ability to increase our muscle mass. Increasing our muscle mass has a really positive effect on our metabolism and our longevity because that's going to increase those myokines in our system. Lots of signaling molecules helps the protective everything, brain, body, right? And then from there, we need to find what we like and our balance between kind of resistance training, aerobic and anaerobic, and cycle through that. And I think a lot of people think that has to all be done in a week. But from what I'm understanding is that you could maybe be on like a fortnightly or even a monthly kind of like rotation and just kind of slot everything in, right?
Absolutely. But it's understanding that you will get drop-offs in some of those things if you're not doing them for a month. Like we know that you'll get drop-offs in your VO2 max. For after about really 7 to 10 days, it starts to drop off, as will your strength as well. But it is about looking at the whole bigger picture and understanding what your client's health goals are, what your health goals are as well, and then training accordingly. And, you know, there's a lot to be said for just mixing it up and just shocking the body and just throwing a little bit of randomness in there just to keep the body guessing. Because as me and you know, a lot of people, the mistake they make is they find routines that they like and they just do them over and over again. And you need to give your body a reason to adapt. That's key.
I love it. I am very excited to continue reading your book. The link is in the show notes. But PT, everyone who comes on the podcast gets asked this question. If it was Rainbow Land and you could change absolutely anything in the fitness or health industry, what would you change?
If it was Rainbow Land, I would ban revealing lycra and cut off tank tops in gyms. Get the fucking show ponies out of the gym so that the people who really need to be there can be there. Stick all the show ponies in one place and just open it up for everybody else. I've just alienated half your audience right now.
That's fine. No, look, this is the controversy that I knew I was going to get with you. That's why I called you notorious. I like it. I love how interesting, like how different all of the guests Rainbow Land is. And I like it. I think that the fitness industry would be a much better place if it wasn't so focused on the vanity side of the benefits.
And it's got so much worse. I rarely go into gyms because I've got my own. And, you know, I will go into gyms. My view on gyms, unless I'm traveling, is that a gym is something that I'm going to keep in the locker when I don't have the motivation to train myself, because I've got all the equipment I need in my basement and I'm pretty self-motivated. But I know that anytime you go to a gym, you're a bit more motivated because of the whole environment. And so I'm keeping that for when I start to lose my motivation. But when I do go into gyms, it is so much worse than it used to be, where both men and females just so fucking skimpy in there. And it's just like if they were chocolate, they could eat themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to decrease the intimidation factor of gyms and just make it such a, you just want a vibe. You just want to, maybe mine would be no smartphones.
That's another one. Because I couldn't believe it. I went into a Fitness First in Sydney and there's just all these people fucking sitting on a piece of equipment, doing one set and sitting there for 2 minutes on their phones. And there was one guy who'd had that, and then he had some of his other belongings and another piece of equipment. I'm like, what? It's not enough for you to hog one piece of equipment. You got to hog two? What if every person did that?
Yeah. For me, that's why I enjoy classes, because it takes that distraction. You know, the phone is addictive. I want to do it if I'm sitting on a piece of equipment as well. So for me, jumping into a class, working out with someone means I get social interaction as well as that physical side of it, which is just, you know, that's the bonus. But PT, as always, your words, your enthusiasm is so blessing for our industry. I really, really appreciate you coming on and giving your wisdom to us today. Any last piece of advice for us?
I think the key thing, given that the audience is fitness professionals, I think the biggest thing that I did that enhanced my knowledge in this area was really trying to understand human behavior and dive into that and understand what makes people tick and how to actually motivate different people using different tools to actually do what you want them to do and what you know is really good for them. Because most people know what's really good for them, but maybe I think those soft skills, and particularly around understanding what makes people tick and how to actually motivate different people, I think that's a skill that everybody should focus on and try and learn just for general life, because success in life is about trying to influence people.
So wise. Bobby would be so proud of you.
Yeah, there you go. Bobby Capuccio.
Awesome. I really appreciate that. Those words go straight to my heart. Thank you so much for that. And check the show notes out, guys. Let's thank PT for jumping on.
Absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me on.
We are so grateful for your support and for tuning in to our podcast. We know that many of you have friends or colleagues who would also benefit from our content, and we would be honored if you could share our podcast with them. Sharing on social media, email, or even talking about us to a colleague is such a huge help in getting our message out there. We truly appreciate your support, and we can't wait to continue to grow and connect with more people through our podcast.